When we think of Hārūn al-Rashid and the Barmakids, I think we usually have a vague impression that whatever the type of sources and whatever their date, we'll find the same episodes or combinations of episodes present and repeated. And mentally, we tend to clump the episodes that we know together as if they formed a single story that can be used as a benchmark, with a narrative arc culminating in Hārūn secretly marrying Ja'far to his sister Abasa and then murdering him. In fact, this isn't at all what we find in most of the earlier Abbasid historians. Dominique Sourdel, Clifford Edmund Bosworth, and most recently Kevin Van Bledel have provided us with concordances of the episodes that the early historians have in common. But I'd argue that what's more interesting from the point of view of tracing and understanding how a legend comes into being is what the early Abbasid historians don't have in common, and how they distribute their Barmaki materials across their narratives. I'll give some brief examples. Ad-Dinawari, who died in around 900, has nothing about any Barmakis in reigns previous to Hārūn's, and just one sentence on a Barmaki in the reign of Hārūn, when he mentions that Hārūn, passing through Baghdad on his way to his residence in Raqqa in the year 189, ordered Ja'far's gibbets to be burnt. No backstory is provided. At around the same time, al-Yaqubi's account of the reign of Hārūn and the role of the Barmakis is devoid of stories, except for Yahya's premonitory vision of the apparition of a monk a year before Ja'far's death in a monastery. A few decades later, al-Mas'udi hives off the Barmakis from his account of the reign of Hārūn into a separate chapter of his Muruj al-Dhahab. It contains the story of Ja'far and Abasa, but not a lot else. 1/3 of it is given over to definitions of love propounded in the Sanad of Yahya ibn Khalid. And Ja'far's executioner isn't the eunuch Masrur, but Yasir. It's only with the Tabari that we find the story of the Barmakis full-blown and interwoven with regnal history. His account includes a short version of the story of Abasa and 2 versions of the beheading of Ja'far by Masrur. Finally, and chronologically last, al-Jahshiyari. Sourdel gives a detailed account of how he used the Tabari in his Book of Viziers, or how he and Tabari used a common source. Sourdel stresses the contrast between al-Jahshiyari's thematic technique and Tabari's chronological narrative. As Sourdel points out, there's no Abasa story in Jahshiyari, who quotes Masrur himself, dismissing the story as nonsense. Based on this overview, Tabari seems to be the main architect of the legend of the Barmakis as we now think of it. That's because he turns it into a narrative. The interweaving of their story with Hārūn's gives it a relentless chronology, and it has dramatic shape, with Yahya playing kingmaker to Hārūn during the reign of his jealous brother al-Hadi at one end of the tale, and at the other end, less than 20 years later, after the rise and rise first of Yahya's elder son al-Fadl, then of Ja'far, the treble dramatic climax of the Abasa story, the beheading of Ja'far, and Hārūn's cruel imprisonment of Yahya al-Fadl and all but one of the surviving Barmakis. But a legend doesn't have to be a story. It can also be a theme, as Sourdel pointed out. We might ask which came first, the story or the themes. Al-Tabari, like all his contemporaries, undoubtedly put his grand narrative together from an assortment of akhbar, or mini-narratives. Where did he get them? He provides us with a few isnads, lists of names of informants. If we compare his isnads with the isnads in thematic compilations, which is something that hasn't yet been done, we might be able to find out what were the literary and scholarly circles where materials about the Barmakis circulated and started to be fashioned into the stuff of legend. And if we consider the contexts provided by the thematic compilations as being deliberately shaped to convey their own messages, which the Barmaki materials could be tailored to illustrate, we'll be able to intersect various points in the uses that the evolving Barmaki legend could be put to by identifiable historical agents. In this paper, I'll look briefly at 3 themed compilations that are close in date to each other, 2 of them only a few decades later than al-Tabari, one of them 3/4 of a century later. It's important to be aware that all 3 were compiled under Buyid rule when the Abbasid caliphs were puppets. They all look back nostalgically to the pre-Buyid caliphate and to the reign of Hārūn and the role of the Barmakids as a high point and a defining point of Abbasid prestige and legitimacy nearly 200 years before. They're all huge books, very well known and much used, but nevertheless under-researched, and the Barmakids occupy a comparatively small amount of space in them. The mentions of the Barmakids in the enormous, unfinished book of songs, Kitāb al-Aghānī by al-Faraj al-Isfahānī, form part of his depiction of the cultural economy of the early Abbasid Empire, especially in Baghdad. He has entries on the poets whose eulogies and the musicians whose songs pleased various Barmakids and whose careers partly depended on their patronage. I think the musical arts rank above the poetic arts in Abul Faraj's scale of values. Poetry was court poetry of 2 sorts, panegyric, which was adulatory of the Barmakids, much more so than of Hārūn. The Barmakids are shown as slightly comically lapping up praise, however simplistic, and this poetry is widely quoted by historians for illustrative purposes. Then there was love poetry, for more intimate occasions, which, when it was set to music, caused delight and, at its best, ecstasy and a sense of complete release, almost drug-like, in its small, select and wealthy audience. In Kitāb al-Aghānī, the arts dominate everything else, and the Barmakids play the role of outstandingly knowledgeable as well as munificent patrons of the arts. The best-known pupil of Abul Faraj al-Isfahānī was al-Muḥassin al-Tanūxi, who transmitted stories from the Book of Songs without sharing Abul Faraj's idea of music or art as the defining values of civilization. Instead, al-Tanūxi's deliverance follows adversity, al-Faraj baʿd shidda, purports to show how, thanks to the divine plan, human misfortunes can muddle their way through to happy endings through human interventions, including a kind of generous and sympathetic helping hand that the Barmakids gave their petitioners. A short generation after Abul Faraj al-Isfahānī and al-Tanūxi, the Dictionary of National Biography of its time, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's Tarikh Baghdad, gives us independent anecdotal character sketches of the main figures of the Barmaki family and of Hārūn al-Rashid. Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi's attempt to capture and commemorate the Abbasid capital city through its notable inhabitants is often thought to be concerned almost exclusively with who its biographical subjects transmitted hadith from and to. However, his entries on Yahya, al-Fadl and Ja'far are among a good few that don't bear out that characterization. They're not credited with a single hadith. It's also remarkable that al-Khatib's entry on Hārūn ignores the Barmakids. All 3 of these compilations systematically use isnads for every item of information. Kitāb al-Aghānī mentions 1 or more Barmakids, or the Barmakids collectively, in some 130 akhbar. At either end of the isnads, there are some recurrent sources, the earliest person that a story is attributed to, and some recurrent informants, the person who ultimately tells the story to Abul Faraj. But the chains of transmitters in between recurrent source and a recurrent informer are rarely identical. This suggests materials circulating quite widely. But the isnads need investigating in detail to confirm this. What can be noted even on a superficial overview, is that the transmitters and informants are musicians, literati and scholars who moved in court circles or specialised in court literature. The legend they were helping to shape was therefore a literate and literary legend. Its theme is that art is the most powerful force and that great artists, even if they began life as slaves and common craftsmen, can speak as equals to princes. The Book of Songs has very few of the episodes that we find in al-Tabari, except for variant accounts of Ja'far's death at the hands of Masrur, close to Tabari but not identical, one of which has Masrur himself as its source. And it's worth pointing out that while making a protagonist the source of a story may be a literary device, there's no reason to be suspicious of the identities of subsequent transmitters. One story that's found in Kitāb al-Aghānī and not in any of the other books I've mentioned is the germ, if not exactly the prototype, of the story of the Barmakids feast, only it's told the other way round. After a little teasing, the hungry guests get fed and paid by the Barmakid who has invited them to dinner. And not only do they get fed, as I said, they get given money. Money is the leitmotif of all the Kitāb al-Aghānī Barmakid stories. The fabulous sums routinely, even compulsively given by the Barmakids, often in cash. Al-Tabari cites similar sums, and we might ask, where did the money come from? Is this really how money circulated at the top end of Abbasid society? To al-Faraj, the absolute value of art is unquestioned, hence money has symbolic as well as real value. The virtue of art is reflected in the virtue of spending lots of money on it. Great art is truly priceless, so great artists are repeatedly rewarded. The function of people like the Barmakids seems to be, for al-Faraj, more or less entirely to provide a discriminating audience and a market for art. He seldom shows them doing anything else. They're less actors in their own legend than bit players in a greater legend, the legend of the power and authority of art and artists. This is literally the case because al-Faraj organised the Book of Songs into entries on poets, singers and songs, but there are no entries on patrons. Coming now to Tanuhi, the pupil of al-Faraj, his big book on deliverance after adversity has around 500 stories in it, and it's organised into chapters on situations or indeed plot types, not particular individuals. For example, chapter 4, speaking truth to power and averting its fury, or checking death with an eloquent homily. Although Tanuhi tucks material taken from al-Faraj's Book of Songs and al-Jahshiari's Book of Viziers into this structure, what he does with it is often startlingly different. There's only time today to note 3 aspects. Firstly, whenever he can, Tanuhi provides very detailed isnads. For example, for an item which includes a report that one of the reasons why Hārūn had Ja'far beheaded was that he'd imprisoned and beheaded an uncle of Hārūn's, also called Ja'far, without telling Hārūn, and had sent him his head as a Nowruz present. Tanuhi tells us that it's from a book called al-Mubayyada by somebody called Abu al-Abbas Ahmad ibn Ubaydullah ibn Ammar, which was taught to Tanuhi in Basra, his hometown, in Muharram 345, meaning that Tanuhi, born in 327, would have been in his late teens, and in fact we know enough about his life to situate the date more precisely in his development. And there's more information in this isnad and in many other isnads that we can dig out of Tanuhi. Secondly, Tanuhi is a narratologist. Like al-Faraj, al-Jahshiari and indeed al-Tabari, he cites different versions of events. But what interests him is plainly not just the content of the story, let alone its factuality or fictionality, but the way a plot or situation can be developed in different ways, sometimes with a different cast of characters, sometimes very briefly, sometimes at length, and in all sorts of different registers. An example is a story and a sequence of story variants that are both part of the rather ragbag chapter 7, those saved from affliction or straitened circumstance, either by design or by happenstance. Story number 300, which is attributed to Masrur as narrator protagonist, unfortunately has no isnad. Perhaps it's a genuine folk story. It's set in the reign of al-Ma'mun, whose intelligences espy an old man who comes at night to weep over the ruins of the Barmakids, seated in an iron chair which a black slave sets up for him. Masrur brings him to be interrogated. He describes to the caliph how the Barmakids, first Yahya, then his sons al-Abbas and Musa, rescued him from poverty after he strayed by chance into the wedding party given for Yahya's daughter, where the 101 guests were waited on by 101 richly dressed slaves and presented by them with fabulous gifts on 101 trays. The Barmakids, after this party, heard the man's tale of woe and gave him a mansion and a fortune, but he has shared in their fall and is now destitute. Although al-Ma'mun restores his fortune, it's thanks to the enduring barakah of the Barmakids that he does so, the man declares. Sometime later in the same chapter, we come upon a sequence of Barmaki stories that follow a similar pattern and derive from a variety of sources and informants, all of them belonging to courtly and administrative circles. They're historicised precisely and are given intimate domestic settings with concrete physical detail, realistic dialogue between man and wife, and psychological exploration of the feelings of a man who has lost his status. The protagonists vary. Sometimes they're Khalid al-Barmaki and his son Yahya, sometimes other members of the administrative class. What matters in these stories is not so much precise identities as human values and human relations, not to mention class loyalty between administrators. This is the third thing that makes al-Tanūkhi different from al-Faraj in his approach to the Barmakids. His Barmakids are not unique. They can do great good, but they can also find themselves in the same hard places as other people and in need of their help. I may have done al-Faraj an injustice in suggesting that for him the rich exist only to subsidise artists and that their human quirks are interesting to him only insofar as they give artists a handle to manipulate them. But by not putting art and art alone centre stage, al-Tanūkhi uses his materials to shape a much broader and richer idea of social interdependence and of people in general, where anyone can meet anyone else and the same stories apply to everyone and are worth telling from every point of view. If we want to take the idea of this workshop further and explore stories as something that can and should feed political thinking today, then I think that what al-Faraj and al-Tanūkhi do with similar storylines, differently filled out and organised, is instructive. al-Faraj, for all his exquisite understanding of artists, which I haven't attempted to convey in this paper, could be seen as ultimately simply offering them a charter for sucking up to oligarchs and autocrats. al-Tanūkhi, partly educated by him and bound to him by deeply personal ties, but not obsessed by music, comes up with a very different take on society. Finally and briefly, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and the Barmakids. This brings us back to isnads. Al-Khatib is respectively 1 and 2 literary generations down the line from al-Faraj and al-Tanūkhi. Therefore, his isnads have at least 2 extra layers compared to theirs, and can tell us that much more about the shaping and circulation of Barmaki themes and the Barmaki legend in a fairly well-defined time and place. Like al-Tanūkhi, al-Khatib al-Baghdadi seems to view the Barmakis as benefactors of society in general, not just of poets and musicians. And the biographical portraits he constructs show them as human and admirable and sympathetic, regardless of their lack of religious activity. Another thing worth putting into the basket of how old stories can maybe help people think today.
Thank you very much.
I think this segues really nicely from Julia's paper about the Barmakids and the Arabic sources. I'm going to take you to the Persian sources, I'm very happy to say. So let me start by saying that it was with the acquisition of the collections of Sir William and Sir Gore Ouseley, who had travelled widely in the East as part of their diplomatic mission to the Qajar court in Iran, that the Bodleian's Persian collections really reached their height. And while you're in Oxford, I mean, sorry, it's the weekend, they'll be closed, but if you do get a chance to go to the Bodleian, these are very well worth seeing. The Ouseleys brought many Persian manuscripts to Oxford, including this one, which is an Akhbar Barmakids, so Ouseley 217. It has, this manuscript is one of the lesser known manuscripts, if you want, in the collections. Here we have some beautiful Shahnames and other perhaps better known texts. But this one I chose specifically when I came to do a Bahari fellowship at the Bodleian Library, because there is an effort in the Bodleian also to attract scholars who would like to work with lesser known Persian manuscripts. So if you are interested in doing that, do consider the Bahari Fellowship. So this manuscript has no colophon, but it's clear it's not an autograph copy and that it doesn't date to the time of its original patron. Let me move on. Its original patron, who was the Delhi Sultan Firuz Shah, who ruled in the 14th century in northern India. And the copy, it's not the copy of when it was produced, but it's a later copy that was made in the 18th century, which we know from the seals. I don't want to block you. No, stay where you are. I'll stay here. So you see from the seals that it is 18th century. The codex itself has 616 folios and is written in Persian Nastaliq script. And as you just saw, has a beautiful frontispiece. I'll show it to you again. But that's it. There are no fancy images or anything like that in it. But at least the frontispiece shows that it was made for a royal patron. And this is quite late in this is 18th century copy, quite late in the Mughal period. So this is already when the Mughals are sort of declining. So it's not the time of Akbar the Great or something where we have now found there was a beautiful Akhbar Barmakids, which, like the Demot Shahnameh, has been taken apart and individual folios have been sold by Sotheby's, Christie's, and various other art dealers. So, but sticking to this manuscript, it is unlike the more eye-catching manuscripts I mentioned that have lots of visual detail. We're a bit delayed. Sorry. Thank you. Ouseley 217 has been overlooked, as I mentioned, and I started looking at this in 2018, 2019, and then translating it with my colleague Pejman Firuzbakhsh, who was a very active member of the Invisible East program then, and still is a member. I decided to focus on this manuscript because it seemed odd to me that while the Barmakids have fascinated Western scholars for 300 years, I've shown you some examples. I don't know if you were aware, but 300 years ago in Europe, you had tragedies and plays written around the Barmakids, and there was this really sort of almost eroticized fascination with the Barmakids, and it's this term Barmakid feast, Barmasid feast that we heard about that sort of grows in this period. So although there is all this fascination, the sources Islamic historians always used, and I mean us modern historians always used and cited, were in Arabic. And we heard some wonderful examples from Julia just now that starts in the 9th and 10th century and belong to this genre of tarikh, so history writing. I wondered whether Arabic sources or Persian sources wouldn't offer us a different, or rather, that the Persian sources, I wonder whether there were Persian sources that could offer us a different and not necessarily washed down version of the Barmakid history. And I wasn't alone in that. Lucien Bouvard, a French scholar in 1912, I'll show you the reference in a minute, had actually written a study of Arabic and Persian sources about the Barmakids, which was then sort of, I don't know, not picked up by later scholars. I'm not sure why. But as a Persianist myself, I sort of stuck to the Persian sources, And I had already worked also with Ed Herzig when we were working on baʿd, we had worked on debunking this kind of idea amongst the scholars that Persian translations of medieval Arabic texts were sort of inferior or watered down versions, if you want, of the Arabic original. And I think much more, and obviously I'm simplifying, there are others who've debunked this before me. Andrew Peacock, for example, in his study of Bal'ami's translation or adaptation of Tabari's Tarikh, but there still remains much to be done. And I think it's probably not a secret that my interest in the Barmakids sort of started, actually again with Ed as my doctoral supervisor, when I was writing my PhD on baʿd, based on the medieval local history of baʿd. These accounts on medieval baʿd often never miss out mentioning that the Barmakids had been the keepers of the Nobahar Buddhist monastery and temple of baʿd. And here this is believed to be the remains of the great temple of Nobahar. And the Barmakids who we just heard about from Julia are said to be descendants of these keepers of the Buddhist temple and monastery. It's a curious and wonderful thing, I think, that the Barmakids are one of the best documented families who were not royal or caliphal in these early centuries of the caliphate. And that despite their non-Arab origins. So it's quite unusual. And despite their Buddhist and Indian connections. So the link to India is clear. Baʿd was sort of known as the on the way to India, the warehouse of India is often what it was called. So, and the Kalila wa Dimna is also sort of related. I mean, the verse, the versification of the originally Indian text supposedly is dedicated to the Barmakids as well. So there's often this connection to India. Or I should ask, perhaps it was because of their strong ties to India that the Umayyads and then the Abbasids patronized them. It could also be. They were also influential in the so-called Abbasid revolution, as Tabari tells us, which already foreshadows to me their astuteness in the political chess game that enabled them to straddle both ruling houses. So after the Umayyads, they reappeared as vizier and governors in the Abbasid realm and caliphal capital and court in Baghdad. So the crude timeline, I mean, I'm not going to talk about it much, but these are sort of also the key protagonists of the Akhbar Barmakiyan. So it starts with this so-called Barmak. Barmak is actually derived from Pramukha, the Sanskrit Pramukha. Etienne de la Vessière and other people have sort of now convinced us that it is that, which means keeper. It's an administrator. It doesn't mean that they were Buddhist, but they were administering this Buddhist institution, I should say, because it really ruled or managed the lands in the entire baʿd oasis. So this is not a little temple or even a big temple. This is a temple plus a whole estate that comprises 70 kilometers diameter wide oasis in what's today northern Afghanistan. Anyway, so this so-called the Arab sources then turn Barmak as a title into a name, so they treat it as a name. So this Barmak then appears in these stories in a failed revolt against the Umayyads, then appears in Syria. Some versions say as a captive, others, like in our text, say that he came of his own volition. And one of the stories I've shared with you supports, or will show you that, how that sort of is written out in the book. Barmak establishes himself in the Umayyad court, and again, I've given you an example of a long description of how he manages to do that in a very clever way. He adopts Islam, so the stories go, and then gives his son the Arabic name Khalid. So that's the number 2 here. And then it's the next generation. It's Khalid's son, Yahya, who then becomes the vizier, a very powerful man, tutor, administrator to Hārūn al-Rashid. This is the famous Caliph Hārūn al-Rashid, who is features so heavily in Layla, and who Julia was also talking to us about. his wife. So there's this whole bond of nursing. Is it his wife? I forget. Is it Hārūn al-Rashid's wife? No, Yahya's wife nurses Hārūn's son, and there's this bond between Yahya's sons and Hārūn that is sort of equivalent in Arab custom to kinship. And his sons I've shown you here, and just the final ending, we all know, it all ends terribly. Rashid has Ja'far executed. Ja'far, the good-looking, handsome, clever one who has an affair with his half-sister, Abbaseh, and that sort of foreshadows the end of the beginning of the fragmentation of the caliphate, and that's echoed in the Arabic sources as well. Okay, so that's sort of reflected in our text as well. So the Arabic sources, what is their UA source, if you want their original source? Ehsan Abbas studied in detail this question, and it was then summarized by Bosworth, and it comes down to one original, if you want, Arabic source from the time of the Barmakids. And this is also discussed by Kevin Van Bladel and others. And then what you find is what Julia presented us so wonderfully, these sort of anecdotal bits, sometimes more detail, sometimes less. But what happens then in the Persian sources? So the Persian sources, so Pejman did a wide survey, and he found lots and lots of Persian manuscripts. Again, these are never mentioned in sort of encyclopedia entries on the Barmakids or anything like that. But what happens is that the Persian ones do sort of biopics. They do the whole history of the Barmakids, unlike what we've seen in the Arabic, where you have integrated into thematic sources and so on, anecdotes. And so here they become the sort of centerpiece of whole codexes. And so what is the common refrain in our text, or what is the sort of aim or the message in Akhbar Barmakiyan here in the Bodleian is, yes, all the things Julia mentioned, generosity and so on, big parties, lots of cash being given and so on, but it's always at the service of the bigger message, which is how to be a good administrator. So it's all about administration, and one can understand perhaps why, because he's writing this text for his patron, who is a sultan, after all. So in a way, this becomes this kind of text, and then there are more that follow later after this, becomes a sort of hybrid of tarikh and nasihat, mirrors for princes or advice for rulers kind of text in the Persian sources. So Ouseley, as I said, what do I have here? So then you find some, Pejman found dozens of manuscripts that were copied from the 11th century to the 19th century. But what's interesting is that these Persian texts, and ours as well, does not cite this Kermani that the Arabic ones cite. It cites two other people who it says lived in the time of the Barmakids. I mean, this one, Tayafi, supposedly lived in the time of the Barmakids, and Labari, who did the first Persian translation. And they are said by our source, by the Akhbar Barmakiyan, that they lived in the Samanid and Ghaznavid periods. We have no way to test that or to check that. So let me show you here so just to underline, so these are the sources reported by Barani, by our author, lost obviously, and then he gives us who transmitted them in the Samanid and Ghaznavid periods, and then I've given you, these are some later ones. If you want to read more about these sources, read our article, just one article. Okay. So Barani, and I'm going to introduce you to the text more specifically. So he completes this quite late in his career. He's already written a Tarikh-i Firuz Shahi for his patron. And he specifically states that this is a translation, so just this is in the second line of the manuscript, Tarjumah, you can see here, al-Aghānī have translated it from Arabic into Persian, etc. So then he tells us that he's doing this because in the Barmakids we can learn so much about good administration, as I said. And I mentioned that there is this hybridization, and the way he structures the book is in hikayot. So we have stories, they're not numbered, but we counted them, and there are 70. So again, the number 70, we know it from the Fazail al-Bach. We had 70 ulama who were highlighted. So obviously any multiple of 7 is always an auspicious number. So he then, okay, so here. So Enass was mentioning that her text didn't have a storyline. Ours does. Ours is, the stories are chronologically organized, and there are themes, common themes that I already mentioned at the beginning that come out of it. So we start with the emigration from Ajam, from the lands of the east, from Persia, arrival in the Umayyad court. Then we have arrival in the Abbasid court. And here's where the trouble starts, with Jafar having an affair with the caliph's half-sister. But then always in between you have all these moralistic stories, and they always end with a moral. So there's beautiful dialogue, there's lots of description of buildings, of gardens, of cities, of battles, and then comes back to the storyline of that I mentioned, this arc, right? So coming from east, then having this heyday, this golden period in the courts, and then slowly going down. So far, so good. But what's different, I think, here is you have what happens after the trouble. So after the Barmakids are imprisoned and die, there's a whole set of stories emphasizing Hārūn al-Rashid's remorse. And Hārūn al-Rashid's, empire caliphate crumbled, and he realizes that he was perhaps poisoned by feelings of envy, jealousy, and he actually loved Jafar and the other Barmakids so much. And then you also have more stories where the Barmakids, they're survivors, not the ones who were killed and die in prison, but their relatives who survive, who the caliph has now sent off in exile to a village, how they get restituted. So the now Caliph Ma'mun in the end brings them back and gives them their status back, gives them their land back, gives them positions back, and then there's this whole sort of thing of even in prison the Barmakids loved Hārūn and they forgave him because they're such big people. So that's sort of the narrative arc. So I think I have 5 minutes. That's perfect. So just to close, I wanted to make a few points about this text. First of all, authenticity, right? So the author cites, as I said, his original Arabic source, this at-Tayyifi, who is said to have lived at the time of the Barmakids in the Abbasid court. There's no mention of Kermani whatsoever, but what Pejman managed to do was he managed to cross-reference the next line of transmission, so after these Arabic original transmitters, and he managed to trace them back as far back as the Arabic sources. All this to say that we don't feel that the Persian accounts are any less authentic or any further away from the original sources than the Arabic. So that's the one thing that, there is this very similitude, if you want. You recognize the people, the caliphs, the governors, the musicians, lots of Kitāb al-Aghānī stuff. The musicians, the poets, they're all historical characters. The events, the dates, they're accurate as well. So there's a lot of that sort of historicity, but then there's a lot of wonderful dialogue, entertaining dialogue, and descriptions that we don't know whether the descriptions of these palaces and gardens are Barani speaking or whether he's taken it from something earlier. It's probably Barani speaking. But anyway, that's the point on authenticity. The second thing is on transmission. We were able to, or Pejman really, managed to identify in the Persian sources two, if you want, lines of transmission. And I won't go into detail on that now. The third concerns content. So again, very different from the Arabic. Here we have 70 stories in ours. There is another book of the Barmakids from a century later, Timurid text that Scheffer studied, in which you find 84 stories. Bosworth's reconstruction of al-Kirmani gave us 16 stories. I don't know, you'd need to do a bigger study to really see whether there's a trend here, but certainly you seem to have a proliferation of stories, although Julia, I think you mentioned something with 100 and something stories in another text. I don't.
In Kitāb al-Aghānī they come into 130 stories.
They're anecdotes into 100, but they're not. Yeah, the main subject. Yeah. Okay. So and the stories are always introduced, by the way, with these red headers, Mangulast or Naglast or Hikayat. The next point I wanted to make is. It's an eclectic mix. You have some fantastical stories, and I've given you in your handout. We won't have time to read them together, but you can look at them in the break if you really want to, of, fire-eating ostriches and so on. But all these stories always have a moral, and it comes back to being a good administrator. Why these fantastical stories? How do they support that? It's because these stories are told by people who are not serious and are not believable. But the Barmakids would never tell a fantastical story that wasn't believable. So that's the moral of including those. And then they do have this superhero status, so they always help the caliph whenever he's in trouble. He has, he drank too much, or, it's always the Barmakids who sort of save the day. And the other one is, there's so much crying in these stories. There's always some poor sod, someone I would never feel sorry for, because he's usually squandered the money that he got in his job, and come to the Barmakids, and then the Barmakids send donkey loads and elephant loads, and for some, of cash, as you were saying. Lots and lots of cash, but also brocades and gold and horses and whatnot. But there is this superhero thing, which of course I just added this because of course it's only Disney who then turns turns Jafar into the villain that has a more modern twist to it. And then the last thing I wanted to say, so I spoke about genre, the mixing of genres, and the last thing I wanted to say, again, summarize here the various messages. And every story, as I said, always ends with a moral where the author inserts himself. So all these things, even the parties and so on, it's all for a reason. It's because you want to keep your staff happy. It's because you want to be a good administrator. It's not because you enjoy partying for its own sake. So I think I have to finish here. And it brings me, so here you have all these examples that I've given you. Here you have a bibliography. But just to finish, the crux of the workshop, I'm going to just put this out there for later discussion, is so why did the Barmakid history lesson, if you want, or why give the Barmakid history lesson in this form? The many copies that we keep finding of these stories, some of which have also echoes in Alf Layla, so who came first is another discussion I'm not going to have. But it tells me that these stories and history are deeply intertwined. We cannot write history without disentangling and conveying the stories that are part of the history. And we cannot claim that history books, presumably sources labeled sometimes by modern scholars as tarikh, are the only factual, believable, or non-fiction genre of history writing. Anyone wishing to reconstruct history needs to avoid its fossilization and reduction, which is what Matthew was saying in the beginning. Each new story, especially when it's so widely attested across manuscripts, as these Persian ones, will have a lasting social impact, and therefore deserves an airing and serious consideration. It refreshes history, our memory of it, and its relevance over the ages. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me at your wonderful workshop. It's such an honour to be here and to be part of today and the stories that are being told over the course of the day. In my work, I see where some of these stories end up. So I work on 12th, 13th century Spain, where al-Aghānī, of course, ends up, but also a lot of other texts end up moving on into the Western Christian world. So it's fascinating for me to sort of trace back the thread back into the Abbasid period and to hear the papers that we've just heard, the fantastic papers that we've just heard. So my job, as I understand it, is to provide a pause at this juncture for reflection, and to muse on what we've heard in conjunction, the three papers that we've heard together, and to start asking broader questions about stories and their power and their place in early Islamic history. So one constant theme that we've had in all three papers, and that I imagine we'll have for the rest of the day, is the power of narrative, of the narrative arc. We've heard about the narrative arc in various being fragmented or being constructed in all three papers. It seems that as human beings, we search for narrative in our own lives, in how we understand each other. Indeed, we need narrative, and we place ourselves in society through narrative quite often. We learn through telling stories. I have an Arabic grammar primer on my desk, and the first page is Kuliya wa Dimna to illustrate some point. And often when we want to convey something important, we use narrative. We refer back to narrative. I was reminded of this the other week listening to BBC Radio 4, which I'm a devotee, The Life Scientific with Jim Al-Khalili, who was interviewing a leading climate change scientist, Peter Stott, who was talking about his work of raising awareness about climate change. And Peter Stott said that in the early years of his work, he realised that people weren't listening to what he and his fellow scientists were saying because climate change deniers had a better narrative. So he went to a creative writing course, actually took it very seriously and trained as a creative writer in order to learn how to tell a compelling narrative. And this brought it out. He got singers involved, poets, and he created a sort of public movement that actually went to COP26 in Glasgow in 2021 with him. He had a sort of travelling troupe of poets. And in doing this, he managed to sort of break old narratives about climate change and introduce a new compelling narrative that connected with people, that touched people, that helped people understand, and made his point. And as I was listening to this, I was driving at the time, I couldn't help but think of the Abbasid court narrative with poets, musicians singing around a theme. And the reasons for doing this, the reasons one might employ storytellers to make your point. And of course, that remains the same whether we're talking about 2021 or the 9th century. And that's what we've heard in these papers. So from the 10th century in Julia's paper, the 12th, 13th century in Enass's paper, and the 14th century and beyond with Arezou's paper. So all of these stories that we've heard about concern the creation of meaning, of impact, and of connection with others, which of course is what the whole point of this workshop's about, and the formation of identity through narrative, and also quite often legitimacy. So I'm sure we'll hear about variations on that throughout the day, and I'm looking forward to that. The title of this session was At the Intersection of Literature and History. And so perhaps it's worth stating, I'm a devout believer in stating the obvious, that we're talking about a society, 8th, 9th, 10th century Baghdad, which has been considered a golden age for learning, for storytelling, for poetry. We're talking about an environment in which, and of course this applies to 13th century Nasrid Granada as well, very much so. We're talking about an environment in which a slave might be prized for their ability to tell stories, one in which poetry played a huge role. The tools of storytelling at their most basic were available in a new way. So the introduction from the 8th century of paper into the Abbasid court, and this has an impact on the sorts of stories that might be written. So we're talking about an elite that listened to stories and that told stories, and that would then become the subject of stories from that point onwards, and would be looked back to, as we've heard, by subsequent rulers throughout history, really. So it's in this context that we understand our three papers, all of which are sort of riffing on this theme. Each one has reflected on the telling and the retelling of stories that construct a narrative beyond themselves. So we began with Enass Khansa, and the collection of stories copied in Escorial, which is very near Madrid, in the 18th century, potentially reflecting a 13th century manuscript. Is that understood correctly, that it's the 13th century tradition, potentially, that you're doing? Well, the original manuscript that was copied.
I think it's from the 16th century. So
Okay.
I put everyone's opinion. I didn't add my own. I disagree.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, and that's another sort of key to this workshop is the linkages between manuscripts, between authors, and between stories, which are moving across the centuries, as you illustrated, with those beautiful pictures as well. So we had Persian stories, we had Damascus, and all of this makes its way to Granada, Nazareth, Granada, then up to Escorial. Of course, when we think about medieval Spain, we're thinking about a culture of translation as well. So the movement of stories is something that Enass really brought to life. I think we asked similar questions in Arezou's paper. Hers was a study of the account by 14th century author Al-Aghānī of the history of the Barmakids, in a manuscript, again drawn up in the 17th century. So once again we have a jump in the time. So again we have stories weaving through genre as well, and also through language. In exploring Al-Aghānī's text, and indeed other Persian texts on the Barmakids, Arezou comprehensively challenged any assumption that Persian texts could be in any sense lesser than Arabic texts for understanding Abbasid history. And we also heard Al-Aghānī's aim in writing this history of the Barmakids was perhaps to construct a story that had a function. So we're back to the climate change. What is the function of narrative? And in this case, the function was to inform rulers how to rule effectively. A message that was perhaps aimed at the Mughal audience, that was potentially the audience for that, the copying of that text. Julia's paper took us even closer in time to the Barmakids and the Abbasid Caliphate. She demonstrated not the construction of one narrative arc. We've talked about lots of short stories or different stories, but actually she demonstrated the fragmentation of narrative, in that she was looking at the divergences in stories told by the early Abbasid historians about the Barmakids and the potential reasons for these divergences. In doing so, she also allowed us to glimpse through her texts into the intellectual culture, into the court environment of these historians, not least through isnads, which of course are important to raise in a workshop on narrative, because they themselves are little miniature narratives, you could say, constructing an authenticity and providing challenges. So I wonder if isnads are going to come up in that context as well. The construction of a narrative is functional in the accounts that Julia told us about. Once more, the Barmakids were portrayed in ways that suited the needs of their authors, whether as the perfect artistic patron for al-Faraj in his book of songs, or perhaps for their universalist human values for al-Mulūk in his text Deliverance Follows Adversity, which I'm going to try and use on every possible occasion. The title alone, I just what a title. So we've seen, I think, in all of these papers, the power of narrative to bestow meaning, political meaning, dramatic meaning, emotional meaning, in fact, quite rarely literal meaning. The authors we've been introduced to all use narrative strategy to convey what they needed other people to understand, what made sense to them. Of course, as medieval historians, we're all acutely familiar with this problem. The question that was posed in the questions on the leaflet about the nexus between fact and fiction that's sort of where we all live, isn't it? And that nexus, you could say that nexus of stories, is what medieval history is what we're all dealing with. That's our sort of tools of trade. I loved what Julia said at the beginning about historians with the boots on the ground working out who pays tax and others studying stories. And I wonder if perhaps a resolution to that is if we all try and do both as far as possible, so that we progress as much as we can. So the other question that these papers has raised for me is that of translation, linguistic translation, most obviously, and we had that in both Enass and Hārūn's paper, but also translation through space and time, of course. I wanted to bring in Robert Irwin, and who said in his anthology of classical Arabic literature that translation is like a séance with the dead. What comes out will often read like urgent nonsense. And that really touched home for me. I'm sure it will for everybody else. Again, it's stating the obvious, but when you translate a text, you change it in a fundamental way whilst even trying to keep it the same. And so stories are transformed to fit a new context, to make sense to a new audience. Perhaps names are changed to meet a new language, a new way of pronouncing vowels, a new set of linguistic constructs, basically. Concepts morph, or they need explanation in ways that change them. So this is something, again, I think will come back again and again, the movement of stories. I think when we're talking about storytelling, we must also remember that we're actually bringing in audiences, whether we are aware of them or not. So for whom are stories written? They're written for an audience. When we're lucky, we have a record of who this might be, perhaps a patron or perhaps a way of fixing a text in a society. But that's very rare. Most of the time we're dealing with questions of what century it could be from, and we have no idea who wrote or translated. So for many of the texts, again, we can only hazard a guess as to what we're actually dealing with. And I think we should keep this in mind, because the audience is the silent participant in any conference about storytelling. So to wrap up, we've had an excellent first session on the power of narrative and the importance of stories in the rewriting of history. I think this is an important workshop, not least because the past is always with us, of course. And medieval stories are still being told and retold today. Sometimes they're being told to connect, sometimes they're being told not with quite the opposite aim. One need only think of the 11th century figure of El Cid, who's being used by the Spanish far right in ways that astonish scholars of El Cid. So narrative is powerful. This is something that medieval writers of stories knew, and something we know. So that's why it's important we talk about it. And thank you for your wonderful contributions and the questions that will come.
Thank you so much.